Okay. Thank you very much, Franciscos, for that, I assume, lovely introduction. It's very, very nice of you to take the time to think about all of my work. I want to say a very special thank you to the organizers of the Union Enadim for the invitation to come and speak with this very special audience. I feel like it's a very special privilege, and I appreciate all of your patience with my presentation, both the English and the ideas. So thank you very much. I'll begin. My presentation, the title is Plus c'est la même chose, plus ça change. I think that Francisco has told you that I hardly speak French, but you may recognize this as some sort of version of a famous phrase, which I tried to translate using Google Translator here. And I think it means not the original quote that is well known, but the reverse of it. Yeah, so at any rate, the original phrase I will talk about in my outline here of my presentation. I'll start with why I'm using this quote for my presentation. My presentation is an attempt to have a dialogue with the theme for this conference. So I want to speak a little bit about that. And then I will shift into my ideas about how mathematics education, I believe, needs to think more seriously about our historical and social context. So I will come to these words, the Anthropocene and post-Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a geological time in the history of our planet where humans and people are the biggest geological force in changing the world. And so the post-Anthropocene, we will come back to this in a few minutes, is a time that we are already entering where the world is existing without people. The world needs to get rid of the people who are destroying it in order for life to continue. So what can we do if we want things to stay the same? That is, to keep living on Earth. So I have a sort of proposal or a response that there is a model for how we can think about living with these crises that are coming at us, that we're living through all the time, but we don't know how to deal with them. Critical ethnomathematics is a kind of math education that I will talk about a little bit, which I think has a strategy that we can use to think about teaching and learning mathematics. So the last parts of my presentation are to have some examples of what we can or maybe must do as mathematics educators, as teachers and learners and mathematicians, and then a final set of comments on avoiding inaction, finding ways to act in the world and feeling like we're making a difference in saving the planet. So to start the presentation, why plus c'est la même chose, plus ça change? This phrase comes from an anthropologist who wrote a book about the European Captain Hook, who, when he first met the Hawaiians in the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiians wanted their life to stay the same, so they did everything they could to get rid of Captain Hook and his men, and they did end up killing many of them, right? But they found that in order for things to stay the same, the important things to stay the same, other things had to change now. They could not go on with everything staying the same. So we often say the more things change, the more things stay the same. But Marshall Solins, the anthropologist, had this insight, this idea that when people want things to stay the same, they must accept that other things must change in order for the important things to stay the same. So my questions for us are, what are the important things? Well, first of all, that we can keep on living, that children have a future, that we have a life we recognize. How does mathematics education, how could it help to do that? Those are the important things. Some things will have to change. we'll have to think about mathematics teaching and learning differently in order for the important things to stay the same. So I was reading the conference theme for this conference, and the conference theme says that there are constant challenges that are still before us. And so when we all decided to come to this meeting, we agreed to this conversation, I believe. The relatively new awareness of the urgent need to address older issues, such as the right to education, and mathematics education in particular, for students from minority and marginalized groups, the co-education of children with disabilities, but also the individual issues that arise due to large movements of refugees and migrants, climate change, and the rapid growth in the use of digital media. But also, the question in our theme is, what mathematical education do we need, and how is it realized? How is its content related to current social changes, to education in other scientific fields, or to other human activities? So the theme had several axes. The first thematic axis talked about mathematics education and its place in modern education. The need for us, so this is our theme, so I'm trying to talk about this today. How can we create citizens who can deal with the complexity of the modern world and its problems? I'm asking us for the rest of this weekend together, can we really talk about these things? Can we consider mathematical knowledge necessary for both the understanding and the solution of these modern and complex problems? Questions such as how to achieve a deep understanding of elementary mathematics on the one hand, and interdisciplinary education on the other, okay, and so on and so forth. This is in your conference theme. The second thematic axis in our theme has to do with social, cultural, and political dimensions of mathematics education. So as I speak in a few minutes, I'm asking you to think about the questions that I want to take seriously. We assigned ourselves by choosing to come to this meeting. How is the equal access of all to mathematics education defined, ensured, and reflected in the context of educational policies, curricula, and institutional texts, and so on and so forth? And you can read this in the original Greek version yourself on the website or in your materials. Finally, in teaching and learning mathematics, another axis, what practices create that particular culture of a successful classroom in today's world? Okay, so how can we talk about that? I have some suggestions in my presentation for how we might talk about that in a few minutes through the rest of our lives. So I am saying that I want to have a dialogue with that conference theme. And I propose 3 powerful directions for doing that dialogue. The first is to recognize, like many people do, that mathematics is very powerful. It has the potential to empower all learners individually and as members of a community and multiple communities. And there's the potential for mathematics to transform our understanding of important problems. Like severe weather due to global warming. We can use mathematics to understand it. But at the same time, we need to be self-critical and humble. Our knowledge and expertise may be as much the cause of our problems as the solution. We talk about climate change and severe weather, but understanding it just delays our action to do anything about it. We spend all our time talking about it and describing it, and nothing changes. And meanwhile, people are dying. People are starving. Refugees are migrating to places where they're not welcome. Nothing is good, right? So our knowledge may be constrained and limited by blind spots, and also just because we're spending so much time saying we're solving them. So that's not helping. So that's the second direction. So I would like us to worry more about the ways that our strengths as mathematicians and our strengths as mathematics educators are actually part of the problem. It distracts us from doing things. It dissolves important forms of understanding into confusions, words about mathematics that nobody knows what to do with except for the people that say them who already understand it. So it creates walls of ignorance. It doesn't actually help. So what do we do in school? What do we do with people who are learning mathematics in or outside of school so that we don't just worry. So here I am saying, I invite you, let's have a serious conversation. First, I want to step away from classrooms and schools for a few minutes to think about our current world situation, global crises, war, pandemic, refugees, climate nightmares. How can mathematics and mathematics education prepare people to live now and in the future, to have a future? So my proposal, as I mentioned earlier, is we can learn from recent global responses to colonialism. So responses to colonialism recognize that even after political independence of colonies, there are many legacies of colonialism that remain. Former colonies still struggle with inequality and inequity, economic, social, political, geopolitical disempowerment. So responses to colonialism recognize the crisis, but they also try to do something about it at the same time. So that's kind of like the same situation with all these other crises. So I have a charge for you, a demand on you. From my speech is a demand. Use this conference to create collaborations. Talk to each other and to me and to anyone else you can to make plans to continue talking and working now and in the future to create a world that will still be here. Some things will stay the same, but we'll change other things because we have to. Okay, so now kind of the substance of my talk. Some people say, I agree, that we are living in either the Anthropocene or maybe even already the post-Anthropocene. So this is a geological moment in the history of the planet. Humans are transforming and destroying ecosystems, oceanic balances, climate, and so on, etc. The post-Anthropocene, we could say, is already here. Humans are already suffering in ways that they never suffered before, with serious crises. We are already being replaced as the dominant force in the world because we've already overreached with our ways of living. So the planet is kind of responding by letting us kill ourselves off. And you might say, what does this have to do with teaching and learning mathematics? I want to say, what does this have to do with teaching and learning mathematics? Maybe we need to take that question seriously. Right? We and our students are living in the post-Anthropocene without creating forms of education and social action that would help us to find meaning and joy in this world. Until we do, the antiquated, old-fashioned education of the Anthropocene keeps us bewildered and confused at the changes in our planet and our world without giving us any tools to live in our world. It continues to hold us back, continues to fail us. Meanwhile, mathematical modeling and mathematical methods have helped. You know, sure, that's really great. Mathematicians are, I love mathematics. We can study viruses, we can create vaccines, we can regulate regulation and systematic reduction of economic disasters. There's prediction of cataclysmic climate changes and more. Sure, we do all that, but are these seemingly powerful uses of mathematics little more or nothing more than distractions that prevent us from really doing anything about these colossal crises? Is humanity really doing the work that needs to be done? We have angst, dread, fear, apprehension. What do we do? So we can ask, how might mathematics education support our students, our communities, and institutions through the combined sense of being overwhelmed, together with the ominous foreboding that entangles each of us, preventing progress in any activity? The dread is overwhelming. Dread captures us in a paradoxical desire to understand and witness the oncoming deluge. We're impotent, ineffective. The promise of mathematics as critical to the solution of problems is also the promise that mathematics can describe the problems over and over, more and more increasingly, as a never-ending nightmare. It only makes it worse. So I propose that we look at critical ethnomathematics, that this is a model of living in a similar kind of situation that came before the current crises, and we can extend this idea. And I have found it useful to talk about this because, at least in my home country of the United States, not every mathematician or math educator knows much about critical ethnomathematics. Maybe they've heard of ethnomathematics, but not so much critical ethnomathematics. So first, ethnomathematics, that's the study of and also action because of mathematical responses to colonialism. Critical ethnomathematics, it's a version of ethnomathematics where it specifically addresses the continuing inequities and inequalities of colonialism that remain and are entrenched in the world. Former colonies still have disadvantages, and school mathematics is the same everywhere in the world. So ethnomathematicians, they look at other kinds of mathematics, but the key idea is that critical ethnomathematics education understands and accepts a paradox. Ethnomathematics can celebrate local knowledges, but somehow ethnomathematics doesn't solve the problem that the local kinds of mathematics are only seen as mathematics if they look like European mathematics, school mathematics. They're still considered lesser or not as good. They're not part of the central body of mathematics education. So critical mathematics education recognizes this as the unavoidable catastrophe of colonialism and tries to say we can do something about it. Ethnomathematicians recognize forms of mathematics outside of European mathematical history, but critical ethnomathematics says this can backfire if you only recognize indigenous mathematics when it looks like European school mathematics. So the problem is that ethnomathematics can function as an example and tool of coloniality by erasing the mathematics that doesn't look like or help to support the current crisis of inequality and hierarchy of school mathematics over other forms of mathematics that aren't even seen by people. So critical ethnomathematics reorients mathematics and mathematics education. It does this work of saying some things need to change if we want some things to stay the same. Critical ethnomathematics is a social movement. It's a big social change movement. It's something like feminism or anti-racism. It's a big social movement. It's something like the slow food movement. Critical ethnomathematics might be like slow fashion, right? These kinds of larger, giant, LGBTQ rights around the world, transnational movements. Critical ethnomathematics sees itself in this big way and says, mathematics and mathematics education are forms of life. They are ways of being in the world. So we must teach typical European school mathematics along with the idea that this is a tool of coloniality. So we have to value local forms of being and knowing, but also help people use the tools of the colonizers to do what they can do with them. This is critical ethnomathematics. It makes a way of living with and simultaneously against coloniality. So the takeaway from this, my message is, can we learn from that and use it more generally, and to say critical ethnomathematics lives with this never-ending crisis. So, at the same time as teaching and learning the power and limits of the mathematics of coloniality, it has strategies of simultaneously living with the crisis and also changing life to avoid the most terrible consequences of the crisis. That's a lot like what I was talking about the post-Anthropocene and the Anthropocene. We can study the strategies of critical ethnomathematics and generalize them so that we can use similar strategies for using mathematics to live with global crises, while also at the same time finding ways to avoid the worst terrible consequences of these crises. This is a new section of my presentation, extending critical ethnomathematics into the post-Anthropocene. The idea is some things will need to change in order that other things stay the same in many ways. So one way we can look at this is in terms of environmental crisis. And so in a few minutes I will go into detail about what if we looked at mathematics education from this orientation of environmental crisis. The second idea is geopolitics, refugees, and mass migration. And the last idea is alternative modes of thought. So the first one, environmental crisis orientation. So a commonly referenced person is Teresa Laura Debart, or Yoro Debart. Teresa Laura Debart suggests that an environmental crisis orientation must take on these changes in the ways we think. So if we're going to use a critical ethnomathematics strategy for our teaching and learning mathematics, we can learn from this environmental crisis orientation and say it should be interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary. And, well, I don't know about you, but very few mathematics classrooms that I visit do this. So it's a big change. But if we make this change, we might be able to live with environmental crises. Okay, Laura Debart says also community and participatory-based approaches, and also different kinds of ways of seeing the world, modes of thought, such as mobile lives. People are moving around the world a lot. Post-carbon social theory, living without fossil fuels and other forms of carbon for fuel. Indigenous lives, ecofeminist, post-humanist thinking, connectivity as our framework. So here's an example that I think fits this way of thinking. There's a book that was edited by Bill Bigelow, and in that book he talks about a unit in a mathematics classroom, the mystery of the three scary numbers. Students in this unit are introduced to terrifying math. The first number is 2 degrees Celsius. Have you heard this? Maybe you have. Students are asked to look for this on the internet, in news, on television. Have they heard this number, 2 degrees Celsius? Many climate initiatives strive or hope to keep global temperature increases below that amount. 565 gigatons. So in American numbers, that's 565,000 million tons. I'm not sure how that translates to metric tons. But this is the estimate in US American measurements of how much carbon dioxide humans can pour into the atmosphere with a reasonable chance of keeping within that 2-degree limit. Another number is 2,795 gigatons. That's the number of stored carbon reserves that are currently held by coal, oil, gas companies, and countries that act like companies and corporations. Initiatives around climate change hope and seek to keep at least 80% of those gigatons underground in order to hope to keep climate change in a realm that humans can still live. So in this kind of a way of working as a mathematics classroom, students use either examples that the teacher provides or they search the internet. They are challenged to find these numbers and see if they see any other numbers. They find as many details about the numbers as possible. Then they compare what they have found with other students' numbers and details that they've found. And then they compare with other numbers that they find when they do these searches. Finally, they put together a discussion of why the numbers are important for people to help them understand, and also why they are important to help describe actions that people must do now. So this comes from a book called A People's Curriculum for the Earth. It's published by Rethinking Schools in the United States. And I recommend the book. It has a lot of mathematics ideas, not all simply numbers. Many of them are very complex algebra, advanced algebra, statistics, probability. Some examples of topics are fighting against and combating nail salon toxins, forgetting the idea of shorter showers. Sometimes children are taught that if you use less water, this will be good. But that lesson is ridiculous given how much water is wasted by large corporations. Fracking democracy. Fracking is increasingly popular in the United States. This way of getting more gas from below the ground. It uses enormous amounts of chemicals and water. It's very bad for the environment. Dirty oil and shovel-ready procedures. Environmental crime on trial. Each of these kinds of lessons in general use critical ethnomathematics techniques to create lessons in units. They all have this environmental crisis orientation. Students research how mathematics has been an important part of creating the problems. Economic objectives, science and technology tools, statistical confusion of public, rhetorical use of mathematics. Students also research how mathematics is being used to try to explain the problems and how mathematics is being used to create solutions to the problems. So that's all interesting. It's an important interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary way of thinking about themes that are central to these lessons and units. Because the students study mathematics is a tool of discourse, for example, used by large corporations to distract people from global solutions so that the corporations could continue to make profits. Also, mathematics is often used to turn responsibility into individual local behaviors, like take shorter showers, save water, or recycle your plastic, as if that really is going to change the world. It hasn't for 2 generations. So why are we thinking that's still something to teach? Corporations want people to do that so that we don't do what's really valuable, which is change the way corporations work so that we can survive. So another interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary theme is how mathematical models ironically lead to these action ideas that are removed further and further from the people who propose them so that the responsibility is shifted away from us. So children will come up with all sorts of ideas based on the mathematics they do, but they'll end up being things that somebody should do, not something that they can make happen. So we can talk about this kind of meta-mathematical idea that the solutions are never something that we can really make happen. They're just ideas, which we can feel good about because we thought of them. Okay, I'm going to shift to the second orientation. In my paper that I wrote for the conference proceedings, which is similar to what I'm saying here, I talk about something from 1915. The US-American mathematician David Eugene Smith, during World War I, created a mathematics book, Problems About War for Classes in Arithmetic. They're all word problems that ask children to use numbers to think about social issues and ethical issues. And in the process, they develop mathematical skills. David Eugene Smith had some very clear advice in his introduction to that book. He says, make sure that in your school mathematics, you use calculations that people typically make in life, and have those calculations be triggers of ethical or value judgments. Even back then in 1915, David Eugene Smith recognized that mathematics teachers enjoy the specialness of something that only happens in school. We can be so smart because we can do these things, but that generates a feeling that the school mathematics is not something you use in everyday life. So he said, make sure that a lot of your time uses calculations that people use in everyday life, but also don't do them just to learn the techniques and the algorithms. Make sure that because you make that calculation, you now discuss the ethical or value issues that are provoked or generated by that calculation. What does that number mean? What do we do with that number? This is a general principle that fits with critical ethnomathematics, bringing that back in. The mathematics supports important conversations rather than being the purpose of the activity. So I'm asking us to be humble and step back and say, maybe instead of teaching all sorts of exquisite mathematical special things that we understand and they make us feel smart, we can do that, but we can also say, let's use everyday calculations and algorithms to trigger really important conversations. This creates the bigger message, the meta-mathematical message, that mathematics helps you to think about your life and to make the world a better place. We can compare some examples of how this can be done. So I once wrote a chapter for a book that compared a use of mathematics that's often criticized as very scary and dangerous, to show an example of how this can be very powerful. During Nazi Germany, there were math books like David Eugene Smith's book, but what they did was they described the costs of taking care of people that Nazis considered lesser than human, people with mental health issues, criminals, people who cannot be fully employed. They described how much it costs to feed and clothe and take care of them, and asked, well, how much of that money could be given to healthy people who need it to take care of their children? Many problems like this. So what we could do now is we could ask our students to discuss, what do you think of these problems? Are they okay? What do you think was the purpose of these problems in this book back in 1943? Right? And compare it to another book that Rachel Kvent wrote, she is a Holocaust educator. She had numbers used in the reparations that Germans asked Jews to pay in 1938. And then again later in 1945, and said, what do you think of asking a special population to have to pay for their existence? It's working with very large numbers. Yeah. So some teachers that I have worked with use some of these numbers with children that are aged, say, 10 through 14. And, you know, they're very large numbers and very complicated ways of thinking about calculating with these numbers and asking, what does it mean? And are these numbers big for back then? How much money did people make? Children ask the question, like, the number is meaningless as a measure. I don't know what that unit means. I need to know units. And they can take the questions about units into other questions that they have about toxic waste dumps and radiation, or other forms of climate change and pollution, or migration, and so on. So here's an example that's more contemporary of this approach to mathematics education that focuses on geopolitical conflicts and mass migration issues. A unit on justice, a role play about food and farming injustice, focusing on the transnational movement La Via Campesina. The suggested procedure is that teachers are to tell students that they will role play in a theater piece the largest social movement in the world. What do they think that movement might be? In fact, they probably have never heard of La Via Campesina. I bet nobody, very few of us, have we heard of this? Probably not. Right? It includes more than 160 organizations with a combined membership of 200 million people. It exists in more than 70 different countries around the world. The people are all networking with each other using social media, helping each other develop strategies around food and farming and justice. So we asked the children, why have you never heard of this? Look in your textbooks for any subject, mathematics, geography, social studies, science. Does it have La Via Campesina? Does it have some translation of it? What we call it, like in English, what would you call it? No, it's not. Why do you think it's not there? Well, we're going to ask, how can we feed the world? Because that's the question of La Via Campesina. How can we make sure everybody gets food? So we can put together fact sheets with many mathematical models about food and farming, and who has food, what kinds of food do people have in different parts of the world. Children, students can create questions for the world based on these fact sheets. And then we remind them, you will be portraying a member of one of 6 organizations affiliated with this social movement. Okay. You will learn about your organization and have a chance to meet with members of that organization to learn more. So they prepare to know as much about that organization as they can, so they can take advantage of actually meeting with real people through, like, the internet, Zoom or whatever, Google Meet or something. They create interior monologues where they write the story of, if I am a member of that organization as myself, I use mathematical models to explain the problems and goals of me in that organization from the perspective of themselves, imagining themselves as a member of the organization. They share and they revise these monologues, the story of themselves as a member of the organization, with each other and other people, as preparation for really meeting with real people who are doing this work, so that they can create an action proposal after meeting these people to really change the world, something better than the G7 has ever done. Okay? So here are some organizations that you may have heard of: the Basque Union of Small Farmers and Ranchers, the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil, the Group of Four, a Dessalines Brigade in Haiti, the National Peasants Union of Mozambique, the Korean Women's Peasant Association, Tamil Nadu Women's Collective. Social movements like this are rarely studied, partly because textbooks assume that change comes from the top, and school curriculum almost always teaches that change is made by governments, and you need to elect representatives that will do something about the problems. Giant corporations can change things. Transnational organizations can educate the world. The United Nations can solve problems. But if we look at the history of the last 50 years, the world is dying, right? So what do we do? So we can come up with something better, and this social movement is really big, and we can meet with these people and become part of it. And we can see that the textbook stories are about power flowing from the top down, but we're talking to peasants, landless workers, poor people, people who are starving, saying, we need food. Textbooks usually tell the story of peasants as backward, quaint pockets of ancient history in the countryside, waiting for the arrival of the modern world. Right? So this kind of role play, and then we can see this as describing very well the new ways of thinking that are fitting with critical ethnomathematics. It places the mathematics of social change in the hands of people like us, just people like us, disempowered people who don't know what to do. This, like in terms of the food farming and justice, it creates a different story about food. Mathematics is used differently. The market of the economy of food, it treats food like a commodity. It's bought and sold and delivered. It's delivered to people who can pay for it. But the La Via Campesina says food is like air and clean water. It's a collective human right. It's something the market can never adequately provide. So mathematics can describe the problem and be used to offer solutions that are described by ordinary people like us. So the big meta-mathematics message that's learned in this kind of an experience is mathematics used by social movements secures and expands rights. It doesn't enhance profit if it's used by a social movement. It actually works for rights and privileges. So this is a real alternative mode of thought, which brings me to the final concluding parts of my presentation. If you're falling asleep, I'm almost done. Okay. Notice how the last example and some of the others were talked about taking action in the world. Young learners of any age in this way of thinking are assumed to have the competence to take action in their community. So they always, in all these examples, they identify groups of people that should know and use what they're learning about. And they plan a way to make sure that they can impact on these people by meeting with them or working with them. So this is a general principle we can use, even if we're not talking about La Via Campesina or whether water usage is changed by showers or not, and so on, climate change. If we take any mathematical thing we're talking about and say, who should know about this? How do we share it with them? This is training in seeing that mathematics can be used to have important conversations where we are the leaders, whether we are 6 years old, 14 years old, 20 years old, 50 years old, any age. Sometimes in these examples, the students identify people who can impact on the students because they can share what they're learning and say, help us do something with this. You're an expert. What do we do next? And those people will be so impressed that they will want to help them more. So some quick examples, and these slides are available to you, so you might look for these things on the internet. If you Google, and I have references at the end of my presentation and my slides. There's a project called Ambitious Mathematics for Young Pacific Learners in New Zealand. Teachers there meet with the Pacific Island elders. They identify indigenous activities For example, students are provided with a context where they advise their elders. They help the elders in important work. One kind of example is they need to extend patterns in traditional crafts. So the elders know how to do it, but the students help them think of new ways to think about it. Yorgos Kyriakopoulos, you might know. Yorgos, and I just know him personally from his dissertation work. So not to embarrass him, but he's worked with Roma communities here in Volos, right? Not in Volos, in Athens, right? Yeah. And there, like, students in his class shared obstacles about arriving at school. Like, when it rains, they can't walk across the small stream. So it takes like 2 more hours to get to, or an hour to get, it's much longer. So they don't come to school. So they use the mathematics they're learning about measurement and building structures to build a bridge so they can come to school during the rain. Well, this teaches them they are powerful people who can change their world. I know another story in his dissertation. The students participated in a community celebration of a new child, a baby who was born. Well, so there were different workers building this extra room onto the home. Some of them used standard European-style measurement tools. Other people in the community used different methods. Discussing this, it was a perfect critical ethnomathematics example of learning both the school mathematics methods and the indigenous methods, and understanding that they both have their advantages and disadvantages, and you should know both of them in order to accomplish what you believe your community needs to do. Instead of waiting for the workers to come back the next day, we can build this for the baby today. Another example is the Cultural Project-Based Learning Initiative in Nepal. Here, teachers describe themselves not so much as facilitating learning, you may find this odd, but they say the mathematics is there to help them facilitate functioning effectively in culturally diverse settings. So they're helping children use mathematics to successfully live in culturally diverse settings. They don't say they're teaching mathematics skills. So they ask themselves, how can we do this? This was the project, and they called it ethnopedagogy. They empower learners to understand the meaning of what they're learning in mathematics through exploring their sociocultural identities with ethno-projects that use mathematics to help them think about the challenges of a diverse community in Nepal. So, my concluding ideas. Students use mathematics to identify actions that are not individual and do not rely on begging governments or begging large transnational corporations and organizations to do something. Instead of just protesting and saying, you've got to do this, they involve themselves in international collaborations with already existing social movements. They're also helped, and this is my last point, new idea, last point, don't be a doomer is the word. Instead of feeling like it's simply too late, we're all just going to die, we say that's not good. If we're too late, if we say it's too late, we'll just have to try to survive, that's another way of saying, I just want to be comfortable, it's too much for me, I can just do what I can, because I'm already okay, I don't have to do anything, the responsibility's not really mine, it's too big for me, I can continue because what can I do? Those big governments and United Nations had better do something about it. Scientists are pretty good. If they've done it before, that's what it's too late means. That's sometimes called hopeism, which is really just doomism. It's like, we're all gonna die and I'm just gonna just try to live until it's too late. Oh well, better make the best of it. So young people really don't talk this way. We have to take our message from someone like Valentina Ducaris, an international student in Chicago. If it's a point of no return, we're going down. But if we're saying this, even though it might not be, it's worth putting in some effort to try and preserve our planet. Or Tim Young, 20 years old. If we do nothing, the worst is going to happen. If we at least do something, there might be a chance. Maybe not now, but later down the line, for us to save as many people as we can. don't be a doomer. Let's do something. Okay? So my last thing this is really my last thing. Here's a resource to start with your conversations today. As soon as I stop talking, you can take out your device and go to the Re-Earth Initiative. There we go. reearthin.org, reearthinitiative.org. And it has many ideas for doing something about climate change. It was started by a very young person in order to give people materials for changing the world. So here's just one place you can go. And if you look at the articles link, each of these websites has many mathematical models in them. You can click on any one of these. Fast fashion. Is this working? It's not working. Oh well, it's on my screen, not yours. That's too bad. Okay. But like, if you click on the link, oops, how do I get back to my PowerPoint? Do you know? But I have a final slide. Yeah, I know. But I just, so, oh well, but it's Re-Earthin, REEARTH. We don't have to find it, but if we find my PowerPoint, again, this one, there we go. Is that it? Yes, okay. Okay, yeah. Yeah, but, or you go, yeah, no problem. So I've just like finished, and also, here is my email. It's like my last name, Appelbaum, right? Arcadia, right? Go up into the mountains where we can all meet. We come from all over the world in ancient Greece, right? To like meet and have important meetings, okay? And these are some references, including that website. And that's really the end of my presentation. But look, here's like an example of doomerism. You know, to like a last minute thought. Don't ride a bicycle, it's bad for the economy. Cycling is a disaster for the country's economy. Okay, but you know, healthy people are not good for the economy. You know, there's no health profits. Okay, so that's the end of my conversation.